colleagues for being here. I know it's a gorgeous day in Australia and you could be outside, so I appreciate you taking some time to listen and conversate with me. I put my email address and my Twitter handle here on the first slide, just in case there isn't time today to get to all the questions or concerns that you have. As my wife often tells me, I'm wasting my time on these platforms, so we might as well waste it together. So feel free to reach out to me, please, on Twitter, or use my email address, which is just my name @gmail.com, or Twitter is Daniel P. Aldrich. So if you go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, I have since 2005 spent a lot of time thinking about disasters when my own home, our car, everything that we owned was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. And in that space of not having a place to stay or a job or schools for our kids, I began reading all the literature I could find in academia and also in public policy. I began to notice a real theme. So at one side of a spectrum of advice coming from a variety of well-mentioned and well-intending people was the individualization of disaster recovery. And this is one of my favorite images here. It's got the teddy bear for your kids. It's got a crank radio so you can listen to the AM broadcast, you've got your food. And the obvious message here is if you prepare for a disaster individually, if you have these various items, you'll be well positioned, right? Should there be a fire, a flood, tsunami, volcano, COVID, or whatever else. So this is one level of response to individualization. The next slide, in contrast, comes from my fieldwork in Japan. If you look at the lady, the grandmother figure there at the bottom left, we call her an oba-san in Japanese. And if you use her as a measurement, it's about 4 oba-sans tall. This is the new wall built in Japanese coastal communities. It's around 14 meters tall. And the government of Japan and many other governments have the opposite approach, which is they tell people, look, everything is going to be fine. We're going to build seawalls or berms. We're going to make fire breaks. We put all these fancy technologies in place. No need to worry about it. We have this covered. So if you think about it, probably your own experience as people involved in disasters, certainly my own experience, move to the next slide, please, is that in reality, in between the individual level of response and the government top-down response, in fact, is the real engine for survival and thriving during disasters and shocks. That really comes from our networks. And we all also know, I think, that our ties that we have are not all the same. Some of us are connected to people who are quite similar to us. We call those bonding, bridging capital. It is these individuals from family and friends who look like us and sound like us. We also have people different than us that we don't know as well. Maybe we meet them through work or through a bocce ball, or do you call it here that? Piquant? They have some funny ball throwing game I've seen several times. Petanque, thank you, petanque, yes, petanque. So maybe you meet people through petanque and you play outside. That's called bridging social capital, people you don't know as well. If you want to be fancy, those are heterogeneous ties that we have. And finally, the third type of connection is vertical, where bonding and bridging ties are horizontal to people with the same level of power. Linking social capital, in contrast, is vertical. So it's from me to the dean or me to the premier, right? Now, why is social capital so critical during shocks and disasters? We can go to the next slide, please. It's because a number of moments during shocks and disasters require social capital. So the very first decision made by any survivor of any kind of major shock, fire, flood, tsunami, whatever, is whether or not to stay in a disaster-hit community or to move someplace else. And we call this very first choice exit or voice. And there's two images on the left side. They illustrate that. Exit would mean it's much less expensive to go someplace else that isn't regularly hit by floods, unlike New Orleans, let's say, where you're always at risk for the next hurricane or the next flood. And to move someplace like Baton Rouge or maybe Arkansas, where there's less likely to flood. There's also more clients who aren't struggling with disaster recovery. There's more money available in the community. So exit is a very strong pull after a major fire, flood, tsunami, and so forth. Voice means, though, that you would stay to work and rebuild the community. What would draw you to stay there? A strong sense of place, a sense of belonging. We might ask people, will you be here in 5 years? How many neighbors do you know? Right? There are all kinds of ways we can gauge this. And we found around the world, in Japan, Israel, America, Mexico, Canada, after a major disaster, a great predictor of staying in place and working on recovery is a feeling of connection, that feeling of voice and social connectivity. A good predictor for exit, leaving the area, would come from a lack of those connections. Social capital also gives us two other powers, superpowers, during shocks. One is the ability to organize collectively. How do we make sure that everyone is there at a meeting, whether it's a staff meeting or a club meeting. It's really hard to get people there. And after or during a disaster, it's even harder. So how do we make sure we can coordinate events, coordinate people's behavior? It really is only possible if there's trust, if there's cohesion, if there's knowledge of each other beforehand. So we need those social ties to be able to have collective action. And the final superpower we get from social capital is informal insurance or mutual aid. Oftentimes, gas stations, food stores, medical situations, even childcare are shut down for weeks, if not months, after a major event. And we draw those resources, we draw that help, not from formal providers, but rather from the informal people around us. That's pretty abstract. Let's go to the next slide. I want to give you some actual data now to show you how, in fact, social capital matters before, during, and after shock. So those red dots that you see on the panhandle of Florida, those are people who are sitting in the eye of a hurricane that will be there 4 days later. September the 4th was 4 days before the arrival of a major hurricane, Hurricane Irma. And the local government began warning people, please leave, get out, it's not going to be safe. The blue dots you see are people who've left that dangerous, vulnerable area in Miami and gone to other parts of the country. And by the 8th of September, when the hurricane actually arrived and pummeled Miami with about 8 feet of water, a lot of people had left, but some people hadn't left. So the obvious problem that we have is those of us working in disasters have a lot of good advice to people. We want them to listen to us, want them to be safe and evacuate early. Let's go to the next slide. But under what conditions do people take our advice? Or under what conditions do people listen to us? What we did is we tracked people's bonding, bridging, and linking social capital against their behavior with several different hurricanes, including Irma, Harvey, and Maria. What we found was the following. Individuals whose social ties were broader, they had more bridging and linking ties, those individuals evacuated earlier and stayed away from dangerous areas longer. People who only relied on family and friends, those bonding ties, those are the red dots you see. Those individuals unfortunately stayed in vulnerable areas, which meant we had to go rescue them or unfortunately do afterwards put them in a morgue. So in the very first moments before a disaster arrives, our social ties strongly impact our behavior on what we do. Let's go to the next slide. Then let's look at during a shock, during a major shock, actually. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shows during the 3/11 triple disasters in Japan, what happened at the village level in terms of casualties. What was the mortality rate there? You see it's kind of spread out everywhere. So when we first arrived on the scene and began doing interviews with people, we began to think, well, maybe the biggest predictor of mortality during a major disaster is the power of that disaster. In this case, the height of the waves. And you kind of see that a little bit here with the tsunami. But if you go to the next slide, we actually tracked 5 different theories people told us about why they think that their relatives did or didn't survive. The first image on the far right is demographics. We often hear that the elderly are most vulnerable during shocks. People thought that maybe the people who passed away were individuals who are elderly. Politics might matter. The center of the slide there is their parliament called the Diet. And maybe we think that people who supported the right political party for a long time, maybe they get more assistance before the shock, better early warning systems. Above the image of the Diet is seawalls, gray infrastructure, the kind of things engineers build beforehand. So maybe some towns had better infrastructure on the ground. The bottom left image is the height of the tsunami, which we've already kind of shed some doubt on. And the final image there is of our social capital. What if social ties could make a difference? How would that play out? So in many interviews we did with survivors, they told us the only reason they survived was because a neighbor, a caregiver, or a friend came by and told them they were in danger and needed to leave. And for the elderly individuals living in a wheelchair or living in bedridden conditions, it was not possible for them to leave by themselves. They were only saved if someone knew that they were in trouble and came to get them out. Next slide will show you, in fact, we have a lot of data now controlling for all of the other factors that we have. Here, the axis is reversed. Individuals with less social cohesion, that's the far scale here, that's number 15, sorry, it's confusing. Those individuals' towns have much higher mortality rates than individuals in communities which have stronger bonding ties. Bonding ties activated during the shock, and individuals were able to get out with individuals who knew that they had gotten them there. Next slide. How about recovery? To what degree do social ties play an issue during recovery? So we tracked a number of communities on that first day after the 3/11 disasters, 2 years later, and 3 years later. Some of them seemed to bounce back really, really well. The bottom 3 cities, Ofunato, Yamada, Rikers, and Takata, they bounced back from very poor conditions to almost fully recovered within 3 years. But other communities along the coast of Japan didn't. What tried to explain that? Next slide, please. So we see in many cases that the physical recovery looks great. All the debris is gone. Right? You can see this is the exact same spot taken 2 years apart. Notice the yellow tape there on that telephone pole. But unfortunately, we also notice that there's no one walking around in the city. There's no kids on bikes. There's no business owners. The next slide, please, as well. The next slide we have taken at 1 month, 1 year, and 2 years. Now, why the white van is still there after 2 years, I can't tell you. Maybe there's insurance fraud going on. But you see debris is being picked up, right? Things look like they're going okay. But again, it's hard to say, are we actually seeing real recovery? So let's go to the next slide. I'll tell you a quick story before I give you the answer about what drove recovery. I visited all the communities along the coast, and I came to this strange bridge-looking contraption in a place I'm going to call Coastal City. Now, the weird thing was there were no cars on this bridge. This bridge is actually a conveyor belt. It's a $240 million US conveyor belt. And if you look at the far part of the image there on the left side, the mountain is now tiered. It's tiered because engineers have been crushing the mountain, throwing all the bricks and the rocks and the mountain onto the conveyor belt, taking it downtown, dumping it there to raise the level of the downtown up by 12 meters. Coastal City got enough money, a city of 16,000, to build a $240 million project like this and another $3 billion. Now, this was the only city I found along the coast that got this kind of major scale construction help. And I began asking very gently, well, can you explain to me why your city got this when so many other cities hit by disasters didn't? And eventually I got the story from someone in City Hall. It turns out the head of the disaster recovery ministry and the local mayor's aide were best friends in school. And they made that phone call within 3 days and said, you know, we need a lot of aid here. And this was, like I said, the only community that got it. Let's go to the next slide. So in fact, that pattern of linking social ties being critical was true across the entire area hit by tsunami. Communities that had more of those kind of powerful ties, linking ties to people in power, recovered better, controlling for all the other factors, local community, aid, wealth, damage, and so forth. So far I've talked about getting out before the disaster, surviving the shock, and recovery. Let's go to the next slide. One more area where social capital makes a difference, I would argue, during disasters is mental health. And we tracked several hundred survivors who had been not only through the earthquake and tsunami, but also for a nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants. And we tracked what we called 3 different patterns. The top row is the ideal type that we hope to see. When people go through a shock, maybe they just bounce right through or bounce back, and they're okay sometime later. Pretty common was the middle row, where people's mental health dropped and came back, but maybe not to where it was before. Maybe they had troubles focusing. And the bottom level, unfortunately, we found in some people as well, where the shocks combined with the loss of a home or a loved one meant their mental health did not recover to pre-disaster event areas. If we go to the next slide, we'll see 140,000 people had to evacuate from the nuclear power plant area around that yellow dot, Fukushima Daiichi. All the shaded areas are communities that had to evacuate, and we were able to interview people from them over time to ask them about their mental health. What we found, if you go to the next slide, was the communities that had all 3 shocks, the nuclear power plant meltdowns, the earthquake, and the tsunami, their mental health was the worst. More than half of the individuals had Kessler-6 or K6 scores over 13, which is PTSD level scores. So we're very concerned, right, for these communities. What will help them bring back equilibrium? What will help them get back to some kind of stability? Let's go to the next slide. We had the hypothesis first that maybe being wealthy or healthy would play a difference. So we tracked income levels and also physical condition. The bad news is being very, very wealthy or being poor, middle class or poor didn't make a difference in terms of anxiety, PTSD from the Fukushima meltdowns. People at all levels of income had similarly bad mental health. And the bad news for physical health was being a marathon runner who only eats tofu didn't make a difference either. But if you had physical ailments before, cancer, diabetes, dialysis, then your mental health got worse. Can anyone guess what one factor we found was protective against this kind of mental shock?
Family.
Fiona says family, great, okay. Maybe good, so family and therefore?
They've got the support network around them.
Fantastic, social capital. Go to the next slide, please. The one protective factor that we found over time and space was having people around you, neighbors that you did or didn't know, people that worked with you in the process. Okay, I tried to argue so far that strong social connections are critical before, during, and after. Let's go to the next slide. North America right now keeps track of infrastructure systems. We call them critical infrastructure. And we have all kinds of areas, dams, parks, wastewater, and so forth. And we track them all, and honestly, we're doing a pretty bad job. But funny enough, next slide, please. What we don't track in North America is what I'm calling social infrastructure. What is social infrastructure? It's the spaces and places in our lives where we build and reinforce these kind of social capital ties. The top left would be a library. We would call that a sort of a public space. The top, upper right hand would be bottom left hand would be a business, a private business, so like a pub or a restaurant. The bottom right would be like a park kind of area, and also faith-based communities. So faith-based organizations, community health centers, or city halls, parks, these are all examples of social infrastructure. And I'm going to say right now that what I think we can be working on to build social capital is social infrastructure. Let's go to the next slide, please. We tracked in the parishes, which are the counties along the Gulf Coast, the impact of a variety of hurricanes, and then tried to see what recovery procedures, what investments of money best brought back people and best brought back business. Next slide, please. What we found was the following. Oftentimes, the money that we spend is top-down, large scale. So here on the chart you're looking at, that's the crossed tools of hard, which would mean things like bridges, roads, and dams. And the yellow flag meaning state, meaning national, regional, or local government spending that money. If you look at the return of money and the return of residents, you'll see that those kind of investments after a disaster did not bring people back, that's the right column, and didn't bring money back, that's the left column. You see they're negative numbers, meaning just spending money on roads, bridges, and dams, or just having top-down reinvestment infrastructure did not bring people back to these communities. What did bring them back? Investments in bottom-up, that's the local, the house you see, soft projects. That would mean things like parks, community centers, faith-based organizations, and NGOs. We found consistent evidence across these disasters that spending money on social infrastructure was one of the best ways to make sure that disasters hit communities would be able to recover people and income. Next slide, please. And the reason that we think this matters is because those spaces, pubs, parks, and libraries, they don't build bonding or linking ties. What they build are bridging ties. So when you take your kid to the park to play, like I'm in Adelaide, right? So we have these great, huge parks here. Take our kids out there immediately. Took our kids to the library where I live in Unley. The first thing that happened was we met other parents. Or if you're a dog owner and you go out with your dog and your schnauzer gets attacked by some little chihuahua and you're talking with them and you meet them as you moved into a community. Or you walk and you see other people walking outside. You're building not only connections, but also the faith that society has people like you doing similar things as you, even if you don't know who their names are yet. They're not your family, and they're also not necessarily someone above you in power. So what we found consistently across space and time is that these kind of parks, pubs, and places for social capital build bridging ties, those ties people that you don't know as well. Those are the kind of ties that we need to have things like social capital, to have things like trust in other individuals, to have things like voice and exit. If you go to the next slide, it isn't just that these ties sound important. We've also measured during disasters what impact is having more of these kind of spaces, libraries, parks, and pubs have on mortality rates. Communities with stronger levels of libraries, parks, and pubs had fewer mortality than sites that had less of those sites, that had less connections. Now, this all sounds really good. What are some of the challenges? Let's go to the next slide. One of the challenges, first of all, is that we simply don't know much about how these sites are distributed. We've begun a project right now in North America, not yet in Australia, to track who gets these kind of social infrastructure sites. As I mentioned, community spaces, places of worship, social businesses, and parks. What we found is they're very inequitably distributed. That is to say, not every person has the same kind of access to parks. If you look at the bottom two rows here, the East Boston and Harbor Islands had zero of some of these kind of facilities. None. No one is there able to connect in those kind of cases. Right? Now, look on the other places, right? Look at the other places here, and you see the very top, massive numbers of those per person, far different. Now, again, I don't know Australia well enough to make a claim, but you all do. So maybe one of the things we can talk about is, what do you think? Do you believe that your community spaces, places of worship, businesses, and parks are equitably distributed? And do you know that from the information, right, that you have available to you? That is to say, should we be thinking about mapping those kind of facilities? Next slide, please. Now, we've also been trying to build our own social infrastructure to see if you can start from scratch, literally having no connections whatsoever in a community. Imagine a brand new facility built on the peninsula someplace, right? Or built in the middle of nowhere. No one's met each other before. Can you, in fact, have people building these ties from scratch? Our answer so far has been yes. We began, if you look, everyone wearing a yellow vest in this picture, those are the spring chickens that we have on our board of managers. You have to be 65 or over. Sorry, everyone on this call looks like they're too young. But if you're 65 or over, you can join. And what we try to do is to make sure that these people have a place in their community, even though they've never met before, where they can connect together. And this has been so successful in Japan. We now have pilot projects in the Philippines and Nepal. So go to the next slide. What happens in this kind of place called Ibasho is we're building a community center deliberately from scratch, people who've never met before, so that they can build up new, broader networks, a sense of belonging, and a sense of efficacy. And being more involved in our new community center that we built there deepened all of these kind of things. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I've tried to argue today two main arguments. The first is that social capital is a critical element in evacuation before the disaster, surviving the disaster, and recovering both physical space, like your city, but also mental health as well. That's social capital. Then I've argued that one way to build social capital that we know connects people who don't know each other as well are the four categories of social infrastructure: public places, libraries, faith-based organizations, and parks. Now, if I'd asked you before this talk, where are the disaster risk reduction projects going on in your communities? Some of you might have said things like, oh, that's clearing the bush, or oh, that's building a new seawall, or that's the new road that we built for evacuation. And that kind of gray infrastructure is what we often go to. And again, our country, North America, often assesses the strength of physical infrastructure, but knows little or nothing about social infrastructure. So that my first thing to think about is, do we need a map in Australia or in your communities, those social ties and also the social infrastructure levels? Next, I tried to argue that social infrastructure doesn't have to be there right now. It can be built right now for a future shock. And I've argued our program of Ibasho, I-B-A-S-H-O, Ibasho, which means our place in Japanese, has been very successful at connecting individuals who are supposedly elderly, who supposedly have weakening ties, and supposedly don't leave their homes, to have those kind of connections. So what we've done is try to think through, how do we make sure we can build from nothing these kind of infrastructure, and it has worked for us. Final slide, please. And I hope we'll have a conversation about this. If you're interested in my work, I've published a few different books, and as I mentioned, my Twitter handle and everything else is there. So I'll stop talking there and we'll have a conversation.